The sun was barely peeking through the city skyline when Mr. Lee stepped out of his local gym, his workout bag slung over his shoulder. His fitted gray t-shirt was still slightly damp from his morning exercise, and his simple black joggers and running shoes made him look like any other early morning gym goer. But there was something different about him today. A quiet excitement in his eyes as he checked his phone, confirming the time, 8:45 a.m. Most people didn't know that Mr. Lee owned 5 of the city's most successful restaurants. He preferred it that way. At just 35, he had built his restaurant empire from scratch, starting with a small noodle shop he'd opened with his life savings 7 years ago. Now, he was about to check on his newest acquisition, the Silver Spoon, an upscale American restaurant he bought just 3 weeks ago. "Morning, Mr. Earl," called out his regular parking attendant as he walked past. Mr. Lee waved back with a warm smile. That's what he loved about his city, these small, everyday connections that made it feel like home. As he walked the 6 blocks to the Silver Spoon, he couldn't help but notice the morning buzz around him. Street vendors were setting up their carts, the smell of fresh coffee wafted from busy cafes, and office workers hurried past with their breakfast sandwiches. The Silver Spoon was different from his other restaurants. It was already established, with its own loyal clientele and a reputation for excellent service. But lately, he'd been getting mixed reviews online, complaints about inconsistent service and an unwelcoming atmosphere. That's why he decided to do something he hadn't done in a while, a surprise visit during peak breakfast hours. When he reached the restaurant, he paused outside, taking in the elegant facade with its large windows and classic awning. Through the glass, he could see the breakfast crowd starting to fill the tables. The hostess was busy seating customers, and servers moved efficiently between tables with steaming plates of food. Mr. Lee took a deep breath and walked in. The hostess, busy with a stack of menus, barely glanced up. "Table for one?" she asked, already reaching for a menu. "Yes, please," he replied simply, fighting back a small smile. This was exactly what he wanted, to be treated like any other customer. The hostess led him to a small corner table, slightly hidden behind a decorative plant. Perfect. From here, he could observe everything: the flow of service, the kitchen door, the bar area, and most importantly, how the staff interacted with customers. As he settled into his seat, he pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket, an old habit from his early days in the restaurant business. He believed in taking notes the old-fashioned way. Somehow, it helped him remember details better than typing on his phone. The breakfast rush was picking up steam. The clinking of cutlery mixed with the hum of conversation, and the aroma of freshly baked pastries and sizzling bacon filled the air. Mr. Lee noticed small details that would escape most customers: a slightly wobbly table near the window, a water pitcher that wasn't being refilled promptly, the way one server seemed to rush through taking orders. He ordered a simple breakfast, eggs Benedict and black coffee, and began making casual notes about the menu design, the table setting, the temperature of the room. Everything seemed decent, but not quite up to the standards he envisioned for his restaurants. The coffee arrived lukewarm. Mr. Lee made another note, then looked up to observe a new group of customers being seated. That's when he noticed something concerning. The staff seemed to be treating different customers differently. A well-dressed older couple was given immediate attention, while a young student with a laptop was made to wait. As he continued his observations, he had no idea that in just a few minutes, his quiet morning was about to turn into one of the most dramatic moments in his restaurant career. The new restaurant manager was about to walk in, and everything was about to change. The beauty of this ordinary morning was that it wasn't ordinary at all. Like many pivotal moments in life, it started in the most unassuming way. And as Mr. Lee sat there, still writing in his little notebook, he was completely unaware that he was about to become the center of a story that would spread far beyond the walls of the Silver Spoon. The breakfast crowd grew, and with it, the energy in the room shifted. More staff appeared from the back, looking slightly frazzled as they tried to keep up with the demand. Through it all, Mr. Lee remained unnoticed in his corner, exactly as he planned. But sometimes, the best-laid plans have a way of taking unexpected turns. Just as Mr. Lee was taking another sip of his now-cold coffee, the front doors of the Silver Spoon swung open. In walked the new restaurant manager, Miss Brooks, her high heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She had only been managing the restaurant for 2 weeks, hired just after Mr. Lee had bought the place. Her face was pinched with stress as she checked her watch. She was running late. The kitchen was short-staffed that morning. The head chef had called in sick, and one of the line cooks was stuck in traffic. Ms. Brooks had already received 3 complaints about slow service, and it wasn't even 9:30 a.m. Her perfect blonde bun was starting to come undone, and she could feel a headache coming on. Table 7 has been waiting for their check for 15 minutes. A server whispered urgently as Ms. Brooks passed by. She nodded sharply, trying to maintain her composure. That's when she noticed Mr. Lee in the corner, still writing in his notebook. Her eyes narrowed. Something about this scene didn't sit right with her. A casually dressed man, sitting alone, writing things down and watching the restaurant operation. In her stressed state, her mind jumped to the worst conclusions. Was he a food critic, a competitor? Or worse, someone looking to cause trouble? She watched him for a few more minutes. He seemed to be paying special attention to the staff movements, making notes after every observation. The more she watched, the more her anxiety turned into suspicion. Her previous job had problems with people who would look for reasons to file complaints, trying to get free meals or cause issues on social media. Taking a deep breath and straightening her blazer, Ms. Brooks decided to handle this situation before it became a problem. She walked over to Mr. Lee's table, her heels announcing her approach on the wooden floor. Several nearby diners looked up from their meals, sensing the tension in her stride. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clipped and professional, but with an edge that couldn't be missed. "Is everything all right with your meal?" Mr. Lee looked up from his notebook, offering a polite smile. "Yes, thank you, though the coffee could be a bit hotter." "I couldn't help but notice you've been taking quite a few notes," she continued, ignoring his comment about the coffee. "Are you perhaps a food critic?" Mr. Lee's expression remained neutral. "I'm just a customer having breakfast," he replied calmly. But Ms. Brooks wasn't satisfied with this answer. The morning stress, combined with her preconceptions, led her to make a decision she would soon regret. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to finish your meal and leave. We don't allow people to conduct surveillance of our establishment." The restaurant had grown quieter. Nearby customers were trying to pretend they weren't listening, but their suddenly still forks and hushed conversations gave them away. A young woman at the next table had discreetly pulled out her phone and started recording. "May I ask why you think I'm conducting surveillance?" Mr. Lee's voice remained steady, but there was now a hint of something else in his tone, not anger, but curiosity. Ms. Brooks shifted uncomfortably, realizing she had to explain herself. "Your behavior is making our staff and customers uncomfortable. The constant note-taking, watching our operations. This is a respectable establishment, and we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who might disrupt our business." Mr. Lee slowly closed his notebook and placed it on the table. "And what exactly about me makes you think I might disrupt your business?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. More phones had come out now, recording the interaction. Ms. Brooks felt her face growing hot, but she stood her ground. "Sir, I'm not going to argue about this. I'm asking you politely to leave." "I see," Mr. Lee said quietly. He took another sip of his cold coffee, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "And if I don't leave? Will you call the police on a paying customer who's done nothing wrong?" Ms. Brooks's face flushed deeper. "If necessary, yes. We have security protocols." She never finished that sentence because at that moment the kitchen door swung open and out walked the sous chef, carrying a plate of eggs Benedict. His eyes widened when he saw Mr. Lee. "Oh my goodness, Mr. L. Nobody told me you were coming in today. Is everything okay out here?" The color drained from Ms. Brooks's face as realization dawned. The restaurant had grown so quiet you could hear the sizzle of bacon from the kitchen. Several customers were now openly recording the scene, their phones pointed directly at the unfolding drama. The simple morning visit had turned into something much bigger, and as Mr. Lee sat there, still perfectly composed, he knew this moment would change everything at the Silver Spoon. But the question was, how would he handle what came next? Time seemed to freeze in the Silver Spoon. The sous chef's words hung in the air like morning mist, and Ms. Brooks stood there, her mouth slightly open, trying to process what she'd just heard. Mr. Lee remained seated, his hands folded calmly on the table in front of him. You're Mr. L." Ms. Brooks finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The clicking of phones recording the scene seemed impossibly loud in the quiet restaurant. "I am," Mr. Lee replied simply. He looked around the restaurant, noting how every eye was now fixed on their corner. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in the office." But before Ms. Brooks could respond, an elderly customer stood up from his table. "I've been coming to this restaurant for 15 years, he announced, his voice carrying across the dining room. "And I've never seen such shameful behavior from management." Another diner chimed in, "I recorded everything. This is going straight to social media." Mr. Lee raised his hand gently, and somehow this small gesture commanded everyone's attention. "Please," he said, his voice warm but firm. "Everyone enjoy your breakfast. This is between me and my employee." The word employee made Ms. Brooks flinch. She just tried to throw her own boss out of his restaurant. Her legs felt weak, and she had to grab the back of an empty chair to steady herself. "Sir, I had no idea," she began, but her voice trailed off. What could she possibly say to make this better? Mr. Lee stood up slowly, straightening his simple gray t-shirt. "Let's talk in private," he said again, but this time it wasn't a suggestion. He turned to the sous chef, who was still standing there with the plate of Eggs Benedict. "Please make sure our customers are taken care of." As they walked towards the back office, Mr. Lee could hear the buzz of conversations erupting behind them. The sounds of phone's notifications pinging suggested that videos were already being shared. This would be all over the internet within hours. The office was small but neat, with schedules and invoices carefully organized on a bulletin board. Mr. Lee closed the door behind them and gestured for Ms. Brooks to take a seat. She sank into the chair, looking as though she might be sick. "I imagine you're expecting me to fire you," Mr. Lee said quietly, leaning against the desk instead of sitting behind it. "Aren't you going to?" Ms. Brooks asked, her voice shaky. "I just tried to throw the owner out of his own restaurant, and now it's probably all over social media." Mr. Lee was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "Tell me something," he said finally. "What exactly made you so suspicious of me this morning?" Ms. Brooks opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. I saw someone dressed casually, taking notes, watching everything. I thought maybe you were trying to find problems to complain about." "Is that all?" Mr. Lee's voice was gentle but persistent. "Be honest. We both know there was more to it than that." Tears began to well up in Ms. Brooks' eyes. "I've made terrible assumptions, haven't I? I let my stress and my prejudices cloud my judgment. I've probably ruined the restaurant's reputation." "Our reputation isn't what concerns me most right now," Mr. Lee said, pulling up another chair to sit across from her. "What concerns me is that you saw someone who didn't fit your image of what a restaurant owner should look like, and you immediately assumed the worst." A tear rolled down Ms. Brooks's cheek. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry is a good start," Mr. Lee nodded. "But it's not enough by itself. What happened out there? That's a symptom of a bigger problem. Not just here, but in our whole industry." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the kitchen staff bustling around. "You know, when I started in this business, I was often mistaken for a dishwasher or delivery person. Even after I owned my first restaurant, suppliers would ask to speak to the real owner." Ms. Brooks listened, her face flushed with shame. "So here's what we're going to do," Mr. Lee continued, turning back to face her. "This isn't going to be swept under the rug, but it's also not going to end with you being fired. Instead, we're going to use this as a chance to make real changes." He picked up a pen and began writing on a notepad. "First, we're going to address what happened today honestly and openly. Then we're going to implement proper training for all staff about unconscious bias. And you're going to help develop that training, using your experience today as a teaching moment." The tension in Ms. Brooks's shoulders began to ease slightly, replaced by confusion and surprise. "You're giving me a chance to make this right." "I'm giving us all a chance to do better," Mr. Lee corrected her. "The question is, are you willing to do the hard work that comes with that chance?" Outside the office, they could hear the restaurant continuing to operate. Plates clattered, conversations hummed, life went on. But inside this small room, something important was shifting. A mistake was becoming an opportunity, and a moment of shame was transforming into a catalyst for change. By early afternoon, the video had gone viral. Local news stations were calling the Silver Spoon, and social media was buzzing with heated discussions about what had happened that morning. Mr. Lee sat in his office, watching his phone light up with notifications, when there was a soft knock at the door. Ms. Brooks stood there, holding a tablet. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. The video has over 50,000 views already. The comments? They're not kind. "Come in," Mr. Lee said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Have you thought about what we discussed this morning?" She nodded, sitting down and placing the tablet on his desk. "I spent the last few hours reading stories from people in the restaurant industry. Stories about discrimination, about assumptions, about being made to feel unwelcome. I had no idea how common this was." Mr. Lee leaned back in his chair. "It's easy to miss problems when they don't affect you personally, but now you've seen them up close. So, what do you want to do about it?" Ms. Brooks straightened in her chair. "I've drafted an idea," she said, pulling out a notebook. "Not just for an apology, but for real changes we can make. Would you be willing to look at it?" For the next hour, they discussed her proposals. Ms. Brooks had outlined a comprehensive plan: mandatory bias training for all staff, monthly community feedback sessions, and a mentorship program for young people interested in the restaurant industry. Her hands shook slightly as she explained each point, but her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "The hardest part," she admitted, "was writing this." She handed him a single sheet of paper, a personal statement acknowledging what had happened and taking full responsibility. Mr. Lee read it carefully. The words were honest, raw, and deeply personal. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify her actions. Instead, she had written about her own journey of recognition and commitment to change. "This is good," he said finally, looking up. "But are you ready for what comes next? This won't be easy." "I know," she replied. "The internet isn't forgiving. Some people will say I don't deserve a second chance." "They might be right." "They might be," Mr. Lee agreed. "But change has to start somewhere. And sometimes the people who've made mistakes are the ones who can teach the most powerful lessons." He stood up and walked to the window, watching the afternoon lunch crowd starting to arrive. "You know, when I bought this restaurant, I had a vision, not just for great food, but for a place that brings people together, where everyone feels welcome." Turning back to Ms. Brooks, he continued, "What happened this morning was painful, but maybe it needed to happen. Maybe this is how we start making real changes." Just then, his phone buzzed with another notification. A local news station wanted to interview them both about what had happened. Mr. Lee showed the message to Ms. Brooks. "Are you ready to tell your story?" he asked. "The real story, not just about this morning, but about what happens next." Ms. Brooks took a deep breath. I think I owe it to everyone to be honest, even if it's hard, even if some people won't forgive me." Mr. Lee nodded approvingly. "Then let's do something different. Instead of hiding from this or trying to make it go away, let's use it to start a bigger conversation." He picked up his phone and began typing a response to the news station. "We'll do the interview, but on one condition: we want to talk about solutions, not just problems. About how restaurants can do better, be better." As he spoke, the lunch service continued below. Through the office window, they could see new customers being seated, servers taking orders, life moving forward. But something was different now. The staff moved more carefully, more thoughtfully. Every interaction seemed to carry new weight, new awareness. Ms. Brooks watched a young server welcome an elderly couple, pulling out their chairs with extra care. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about all the little moments I might have missed before. All the times I might have made someone feel unwelcome without even realizing it." "That's where change begins," Mr. Lee replied. "Not with big gestures, but with small moments of awareness. With asking ourselves hard questions and being honest about the answers." The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the office floor. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, but inside the Silver Spoon, something was shifting. A mistake was becoming a movement, and a moment of shame was transforming into an opportunity for real change. As they prepared for the interview that would share their story with the world, both Mr. Lee and Ms. Brooks knew that this was just the beginning. The real work, the daily effort of creating true welcome and belonging, was still ahead. But for the first time, they were ready to face it together, with open eyes and honest hearts. The local news crew arrived at the Silver Spoon just before the dinner rush. They set up their cameras in the main dining room, where the morning's events had unfolded. The restaurant was quiet now, with just a few regular customers lingering over late lunches. "Are you sure about this?" the news reporter asked, adjusting her microphone. Live interviews can be unpredictable. Once it's out there, you can't take it back. Mr. Lee straightened his tie. He changed into a suit for the interview. "Sometimes the most important conversations are the hardest ones," he replied. Ms. Brooks sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The red light on the camera blinked on. "Good evening," the reporter began. "We're here at the Silver Spoon restaurant, where a viral video this morning showed." As the reporter recapped the morning's events, the kitchen staff paused their dinner preparations to watch. The sous chef who had recognized Mr. Lee stood in the doorway, still wearing his apron. Even the customers stopped eating, their forks suspended midway to their mouths. "Ms. Brooks," the reporter turned to her, "what made you confront Mr. Lee this morning?" There was a moment of silence. Ms. Brooks looked at the camera, then at her hands, then back at the camera. "The truth is," she began, her voice shaky but growing stronger, "I made assumptions based on how someone looked. I let stress and prejudice cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I became part of a much bigger problem." The reporter nodded, then turned to Mr. Lee. "And you chose not to fire her. Why?" Mr. Lee leaned forward slightly. "Because firing someone doesn't solve the real problem. This isn't just about one incident or one person. It's about patterns we see across the entire restaurant industry, across our whole society, really." He paused, looking around the restaurant. Every day, people walk into restaurants and are judged based on how they look, what they're wearing, the color of their skin. Sometimes it's obvious, like what happened this morning. But often it's subtle, a slight difference in service, a less welcoming smile, a table near the kitchen instead of by the window. The reporter's next question was direct. "But how do you change something so deeply ingrained?" "By being honest about it," Ms. Brooks cut in. "By admitting our mistakes and doing the hard work to fix them." She pulled out her notebook. "That's why we're announcing some changes today." As Ms. Brooks outlined their new initiatives, the kitchen staff nodded in approval. A customer wiped away a tear. The reporter leaned forward, genuinely interested now. "Starting next week," Ms. Brooks continued, "we're launching a series of training sessions about unconscious bias. But we're doing it differently. We're inviting our customers to be part of the conversation. We want to hear their stories, their experiences." Mr. Lee added, "And we're not stopping there. We're creating a mentorship program for young people who might not otherwise see themselves in restaurant management. We're reviewing our hiring practices, our service policies, everything." The reporter looked impressed. "That's quite a response to one incident." "It's not just about one incident," Mr. Lee replied. "It's about making sure nothing like this happens again, not just here, but anywhere. We want to set an example for the whole industry." As the interview continued, the dinner crowd began to arrive. They paused in the doorway, surprised to see the news crew, but the host welcomed them warmly, more warmly, perhaps, than ever before. A young family was seated near the window. Their child dropped a fork, and 3 different servers rushed to bring a new one. An elderly man in worn clothes came in alone, and Ms. Brooks herself got up during a break in the interview to escort him to the best table in the house. The news crew captured it all, these small moments of change already taking root. The cameras caught the genuine smiles, the extra care in every interaction, the way the staff seemed more aware, more present. Near the end of the interview, the reporter asked one final question. "What would you say to other restaurant owners facing similar issues?" Mr. Lee thought for a moment. "I'd say that change is possible, but it has to be real. It's not about making statements or following a checklist. It's about looking honestly at ourselves and being willing to do better. Every single day." As the cameras were packed away and the regular rhythm of dinner service resumed, something had shifted in the Silver Spoon. The air felt lighter somehow, as if a window had been opened, letting in fresh air and new possibilities. The viral video that had started their day was still circulating, but now it was being shared alongside clips from their interview. The comments were changing too, from anger to hope, from condemnation to conversation. And in the kitchen, a new sign had appeared, handwritten by Ms. Brooks. Every guest is a VIP. Every moment is a chance to do better. 1 month after the viral video incident, the Silver Spoon was busier than ever. But it wasn't just the food drawing people in anymore. The restaurant had become something of a symbol, a place where a mistake had turned into a movement for change. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Mr. Lee walked into the restaurant. The place was already buzzing with activity, but it felt different now. Every staff member wore a small pin that read, "Welcome everyone," an idea that had come from one of their community feedback sessions. "Good morning, Mr. Earl," called out the host, who was setting up for their first training session of the day. The large dining room had been rearranged, with tables pushed to the sides and chairs set up in a circle. Today's session would be special. Restaurant owners from across the city had asked to attend. Ms. Brooks was already there, arranging handouts and checking the presentation setup one last time. In the past month, she'd become something of an unlikely expert on restaurant inclusion. Her honest telling of her own story had resonated with many people in the industry who recognized similar biases in themselves. "The morning news mentioned us again," she said as Mr. Lee approached. "They're calling it the Silver Spoon effect. Restaurants across the city are starting to look at their own practices." Mr. Lee picked up one of the handouts. It was a simple but powerful document that outlined real stories from restaurant customers and staff, experiences of feeling unwelcome, overlooked, or discriminated against. But alongside each story were practical steps for change. "How many people are we expecting today?" he asked, noting the large number of chairs. 35 restaurant owners confirmed," Ms. Brooks replied, straightening her blazer. "And we had to start a waiting list for next week's session." The kitchen door swung open, and the sous chef emerged with a tray of fresh pastries and coffee for the attendees. He'd become one of their strongest allies in this change, often sharing his own experiences of working his way up in kitchens where people had underestimated him. As the restaurant owners began to arrive, Mr. Lee noticed something interesting. They weren't just from fancy establishments. They were owners of small cafes, family restaurants, food trucks, and high-end bistros. The issue had struck a chord across the entire industry. "I saw the video," one cafe owner said during introductions. "At first I thought, that would never happen in my place. But then I started paying attention to how we treat different customers, and well, that's why I'm here." Ms. Brooks stood to begin the session, her voice confident now. "A month ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career. Instead, it became a wake-up call. Today, I want to share what we've learned since then." She clicked to the first slide, which showed the Silver Spoon's new numbers. Customer satisfaction up 40%, staff retention improved, and most importantly, a significant increase in the diversity of both their customers and job applicants. "But it's not about the numbers," she continued. "It's about the stories. Like the elderly gentleman who told us he finally feels comfortable dining alone, or the young woman who applied to be a chef because she saw our kitchen staff's diversity. These are the real measures of change." Throughout the morning, the owners shared their own stories and challenges. One talked about language barriers with customers. Another admitted to unconsciously seating certain customers far from the windows. Each story sparked honest discussions and practical solutions. Mr. Lee mostly listened, occasionally adding his perspective. He watched as these business owners, many of them competitors, came together to address a shared problem. They discussed everything from hiring practices to menu design, from staff training to customer feedback systems. During a break, a small restaurant owner approached Mr. Lee. "You know," she said, stirring her coffee, "when I saw that viral video, I thought it would destroy your restaurant. Instead, you've turned it into something remarkable." Mr. Lee smiled. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important changes, if we're willing to learn from them." Near the end of the session, Ms. Brooks revealed their newest initiative, a mentorship program connecting experienced restaurant workers with young people from underrepresented communities. Already, 20 students had signed up for the summer program. "We're not just changing how we treat people today," she explained. "We're trying to change what the restaurant industry looks like tomorrow." As the session wrapped up, the owners exchanged contact information, making plans to keep the conversation going. What had started as a training session had become something more, a community of people committed to making real changes in their industry. Walking through the restaurant later that afternoon, Mr. Lee watched the regular lunch service in progress. Every interaction seemed more thoughtful, more genuine. The staff moved with confidence, knowing they were part of something bigger than just serving food. And there, still hanging in the kitchen, was Ms. Brooks's handwritten sign. Every guest is a VIP. Every moment is a chance to do better. But now it was surrounded by dozens of post-it notes, small observations and reminders from staff members, each one a tiny step toward lasting change. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning at the Silver Spoon. The restaurant's windows sparkled in the early morning light as Mr. Lee pulled up in his car. He sat there for a moment, looking at the Welcome Everyone banner that now hung proudly above the entrance. Today was special. They were hosting their first graduation ceremony for the mentorship program. 20 young people had completed their training, and many had already received job offers from restaurants across the city. Inside, the dining room had been transformed. Instead of the usual tables, rows of chairs faced a small stage. Photos lined the walls, pictures of the mentorship program in action, of community events, of small moments that showed how far they'd come. Ms. Brooks was already there, as usual, straightening the certificates laid out on a table. She looked different now, more confident, more at peace with herself. The past 6 months had changed her just as much as they'd changed the restaurant. "The local business journal is here," she told Mr. Lee, handing him a copy of their latest issue. The Silver Spoon was on the cover, but not because of the viral video. The headline read, "Setting a New Standard: How One Restaurant's Crisis Led to Industry-Wide Change." The article detailed how their training program had spread to over 50 restaurants in the city, how their hiring practices were being adopted by other businesses, how customer complaints about discrimination had dropped significantly across participating establishments. "Did you see page 3? Ms. Brooks asked, a hint of pride in her voice. She'd written a piece for the journal about her personal journey. It wasn't just about that morning anymore, it was about everything that had come after. The hard conversations, the daily choices, the small victories that added up to real change. As guests began to arrive for the ceremony, Mr. Lee watched the graduates greeting their families. They wore chef's coats or smart business attire, looking professional and proud. These young people had come from all walks of life, each bringing their own dreams and perspectives to the industry. One graduate's grandmother approached Mr. Lee, tears in her eyes. "My granddaughter used to say restaurants weren't for people like us," she said softly. "Now she's going to be a restaurant manager. You changed her life." The ceremony began with a speech from Ms. Brooks. "6 months ago," she started, "I thought I'd lost everything. I'd made a terrible mistake, shown prejudice that hurt people and damaged trust. But sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes." She looked out at the graduates. "You're not just entering the restaurant industry. You're helping to reshape it. Each of you brings something unique, something valuable. And together, we're creating spaces where everyone truly belongs." One by one, the graduates came forward to receive their certificates. Each one had a story to tell: the shy teenager who'd discovered a talent for customer service, the single mother who'd found her calling in restaurant management, the young man who'd always loved cooking but never thought he could make it his career. Mr. Lee took the stage last. "When I bought the Silver Spoon," he said, "I thought I was just buying a restaurant. Instead, I found an opportunity to make real change. But this change didn't come from me. It came from all of us working together, being honest about our mistakes, and committed to doing better." He gestured to the wall of photos. "Look at these pictures. See how many smiles there are. How many moments of connection? That's what this industry should be about. Not just serving food, but serving humanity, all of humanity." After the ceremony, as families celebrated and photos were taken, Mr. Lee stood back and watched. The sous chef was showing some graduates around the kitchen. Ms. Brooks was introducing others to restaurant owners who'd come to support the program. The dining room buzzed with excitement and possibility. A local food critic who'd attended the ceremony approached Mr. Lee. "You know," she said, "I've been reviewing restaurants for 20 years. I've seen all kinds of changes in the industry, new cuisines, new technologies, new trends. But this," she gestured around the room, "this feels different. This feels real." Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Mr. Lee walked through the quiet restaurant. The chairs had been put back, the tables reset for tomorrow's service. Everything looked normal, but nothing was the same as it had been 6 months ago. He stopped by the kitchen door, where that original handwritten sign still hung. Every guest is a VIP. Every moment is a chance to do better. Below it, the wall was covered with new additions, photos of the graduates, quotes about inclusion, small reminders of big changes. As he turned to leave, Mr. Lee smiled. The Silver Spoon had become more than just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people faced their mistakes honestly and chose to learn from them. When they decided that doing better wasn't just a slogan, but a daily commitment. And tomorrow, they would open their doors again, ready to welcome everyone, ready to keep learning, ready to show that real change wasn't just possible, it was already happening, one meal, one moment, one person at a time.